Welcome back. Senior Pentagon officials have gone public about the military's role in a disputed election. With repeated cases of civil unrest since May, the officials have been talking amongst themselves about what to do if the president invokes the Insurrection Act, which would give him broad authority to order the military to get involved in domestic disputes. Joining me now is the president's former national security advisor. He's also retired Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster. He's the author of the new book, Battlegrounds, The Fight to Defend the Free World. General McMaster, welcome back to Meet the Press, sir.
Chuck, it's great to be with you.
I want to start with these reports. We've had our own reporting here at NBC News, the New York Times. I'm sure you're familiar with both of them, and that there's been a bit of hand-wringing among senior leadership in the military about what if, and the fact that the president did bring up the Insurrection Act once already. What can you share, and what concerns do you have?
Well, Chuck, I think what is really clear for the American people to understand is the military will have no role in a transition. In fact, even talk about it, I think, is irresponsible. And that's maybe why if you detect some reticence on the part of senior military leaders or those in the Pentagon to talk about it, it's because it shouldn't even be a topic for discussion. You know, our founders were very concerned about this, Chuck. I mean, I think it's important to remember that George Washington's grandparents fled the bloody wars of the 17th century in England. And of course, it was the specter of Oliver Cromwell that was very much on their minds,
right,
as they crafted our Constitution and the separation of powers and that very bold line between the military and politics.
What went through your head on June 1st when you saw what happened at Lafayette Square?
Well, it was just wrong. It was more than unfortunate, because what we can't do, and this is really across the political spectrum, though, Chuck, which really bothers me these days, we can't try to pull the military into politics. And some of the things the president has said, I think, have been irresponsible, but oftentimes the reaction to what he says is equally irresponsible. So I think all politicians have a responsibility of keeping that bold line in place. Certainly the military profession does as well, to be studiously apolitical, so all Americans have confidence in our military institutions, and then also there's never any infringement on our democratic principles and institutions and processes.
I'm curious, when you hear the president muse about not necessarily agreeing to a peaceful transition of power, take us back. I mean, how did you interpret that? You were in the room with him. You've probably heard him say some things that would shock people. How did you interpret those comments, knowing him the way you do?
Well, what I think is that it's a gift to our adversaries, right, who want to shake our confidence in who we are, shake our confidence in our democratic principles and institutions and processes. What I write about in Battlegrounds is how Russia, for example, has engaged in this campaign of disruption, disinformation, and denial. And if the Russians can just use our own words against us, that's the best way to pull us apart from one another. The
biggest problem, though, in the Russia conversation has been the president himself. You know, he still calls it a hoax and all of that. And you write, and I think Susan Rice, a predecessor who was national security advisor for President Obama, wrote that this political division is should be treated as a national security threat. Do you agree with her?
I absolutely agree with her, and this is why I think it's so important for us to come together for civil discussions about the greatest challenges we face. Maybe that's a way for us to come back together as Americans, because as we're at each other's throats with this vitriolic partisan discourse, our adversaries haven't stopped, right? The world hasn't gone away. And that's what I hope will help galvanize us to come back together and to reverse this polarization that's so damaging to our security and our psyche as well.
Let me ask this one more question on this. If you made an attempt to get the president not to say divisive things, how would that go?
Well, Chuck, I can only speak for when I was there, right? My job was to give the president access to the best analysis across the government, and then to give the president options. And then once he made decisions, to assist with his sensible implementation of those decisions. I mean, those discussions were wide-ranging, and oftentimes, the president evolved his assessment of situations, and I think in many cases made decisions on foreign policy, which was my area, not domestic politics, certainly. He made decisions that advanced our interests, and in many cases put in place big shifts in our foreign policy that were long overdue.
Did it surprise you that there wasn't a better handling of this pandemic? When you were there, you had a pandemic team on the National Security Council. Were you surprised at the response, given the preparations that maybe you had been familiar with?
Well, I think that what we saw is a breakdown in a couple of areas, right? There are three keys to pandemic response. One is stop it before it becomes a pandemic. Well, thanks to the Chinese Communist Party, we couldn't do that. The second is to mobilize a biomedical response. We see that we were hamstrung in that because over the years our supply chains became too vulnerable. With just-in-time delivery, not enough stockpiles. And then the third area is to innovate, right, and develop rapidly therapies and vaccines. I think that third area is going to be a success. Now, what we ought to learn from this, Chuck, is, hey, we have a federal system, and also we have a mixture of public and private health care. And I think where there were breakdowns, it was in coordination. It was in common understanding of the resources available, where the gaps were, and how to mobilize a response effectively. We have a team here at the Hoover Institution. We're working on that with some amazing grad students to interview everybody who was at different points of this crisis, and to identify the lessons and make recommendations in advance of a second wave or the next biomedical crisis.
It's hard to say the words China and very quickly, but I'm going to ask you to do it this way. Are they a competitor? Are they somebody we have to confront? Are they an enemy? How would you define them?
They're a rival, and we must compete with the Chinese Communist Party, because the Chinese Communist Party now is not only stifling the freedom of their own people, they're exporting their authoritarian mercantilist model. And if they succeed, the world will be less free, less safe, and less prosperous.
Retired General H.R. McMaster, really appreciate you coming on, sharing your perspective, former National Security Advisor to the President. Good luck with your book.
Chuck, thanks so much.
You got it. Hello from Washington, I'm Chuck Todd, and thanks for checking out the Meet the Press channel on YouTube. Click on the button down here to subscribe, and click over here to watch the latest interviews, highlights, and other digital exclusives.